Hello and welcome to the Accelerate webinar series on demand, where we talk about everything it takes for a faster go-to-market strategy for medical devices. Today's guests are Stuart Wright, Simulia expert and business consultant at Dassault Systems, and Stephen Levine, senior director of virtual human modeling at Dassault Systems. Thank you for joining today.
Hi, Shashank. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. So, gentlemen, we've assembled this panel today to discuss some very interesting topics. We find them interesting. We think that the industry will find them interesting. And the overarching purpose as to why we're doing this is that I think we've all identified that medical devices, they're becoming more and more complex. They're spreading out to some pretty niche domains like implantables and drug delivery combination devices. And all of this can make the regulatory process quite complicated. Now, in addition to this, these devices can be used by a large variance in the population. Now, devices in the past, they also had that same variance, but they may or may not have been doing that kind of analysis and studying that population upfront during the medical device development timeframe. And we now know that this demographic can contain infants, teenagers, seniors, and because of past experiences, we're able to articulate that each of these different segments in the demographic, they respond differently to different kinds of medical devices. And since devices are becoming part of therapy, or part of improving the patient's outcome, it's become very evident that talking about how a device addresses each of these different segments and how each of these different segments, what their experience is like using a medical device, it's quite critical. And that's what we're here to talk about today, like how a simulation-driven approach can help companies introduce a robust medical device for an optimal patient experience, for better patient compliance, and ultimately a positive outcome. And I would like to start with addressing some of the underlying assumptions that we may have made. So I would like to get an overarching agreement on the direction that the industry is taking and why it's taking it. So the point of care is drastically changing from hospital and clinic to the home. Self-administering drugs is already a large part of healthcare today, but with drug delivery combination devices, patient compliance to this drug and the therapy, it has a lot to do with the experience of using the device. I mean, this phenomenon that goes back to if a cough medicine doesn't taste good, and or if like a blood sugar monitor hurts too much to use, and the patient will eventually stop using it, even though they need to or have to use it. Based on what you guys are observing, is this primarily why the industry is responding by caring so much about the patient experience? Stuart, what do you have to say about that?
I think you're right, Shashank. As I move around and communicate with our customer base, the issue of patient experience always arises. And I think it's because what you said about the experience and compliance, they are so closely linked. If we take a look at statistics, we can see that a patient that isn't compliant with their at-home therapy is probably not compliant because the experience isn't a good one. It's either a complicated one, or it's a painful one, or it's an uncomfortable one. And so, yes, you're right. The manufacturers, the developers of devices and combination therapies of drug and device, I think they are stepping up to the plate to take the patient experience as the principal innovative force behind what they're going to be doing for the next 10 or 20 years.
Interesting. So you defined that the patient experience could be not necessarily a good one, but it could be one that is too painful, or it's too it's not pleasant, or and things like that. So with that said, Steve, like what are your thoughts on how much patient experience is becoming a concern for device companies, and considering that people are also more vocal now, like social media is a big place for medical device companies to advertise and also for patients to speak about it. So how are you seeing that kind of close communication between patients and their providers of devices play a part in the way the devices are being made?
Well, great question. The medical field, I've found it's a very unique industry. We often talk about well, of course, we talk about patient experience because that's essential. But as a business, medical device companies, the patients are really only one of probably three classes of actual customer. And so if we step back a little bit, what I'm seeing is that the industry naturally, of course, needs to think about their customer experience. And their customers really, in addition to patients and patient experience that Stuart addressed, their other customers, of course, are the clinicians who have to understand the devices, have to administer them, interpret the data, et cetera. So it's important that they have a good experience, so they recommend them, they use them, and get safe and effective outcomes. And of course, the payers, who are customers as well, because they have to believe that the devices are worth the cost. And they have to have, and of course, we know that a device only works if you use it. And so the better the patient experience, the more likely they'll use it, the more likely the payers will pay for it. And so what we're seeing is the device companies have to manage the requirements of three different customer experience in addition to the patient experience.
If I may augment what Steve just said, let's not forget that whereas we started this discussion about drug delivery devices, and one naturally thinks of two subsegments there, the syringe or the auto-injector or the dose measured pen, and the inhaler. But aligned exactly to what Steve just said, where the practitioner is an important part of this puzzle, let's think also about cardiovascular implants as an example area, or orthopedic implants. The patient experience there is also of paramount importance, but the experience of the practitioner very much comes into play, where the practitioner is trying to identify the best solution for an individual patient's condition.
So are practitioners getting more and more involved nowadays, especially with cardiovascular and orthopedic implants?
Yes, they are, but it is an emerging. It's an emerging industry. We're going to start talking about simulation soon in this conversation, and we're starting to see that the practitioners or agents for the practitioners are starting to adopt things like tools like simulation at the in the surgical suite or in the surgical planning office, so that the best possible surgical plan can be devised. So yes, they are, but I think we're still in very early days in terms of at least application of technologies like simulation in this domain.
Listen,
Yeah.
sorry, Steve.
Well, I would just add that there's also one might call a renaissance in the medical field where the device industry is now maturing beyond creating implantable devices, whether it be knee or hip implants or cardiovascular life-saving devices, where they're moving from just functioning to save, to replace the original function, but now far less invasive surgeries, shorter recovery times, longer lifetime, et cetera. And the demands for devices where you have less invasive surgeries require better planning, better understanding of physiology before you intervene, because you won't actually be able to see what's happening. It's the nature of non-invasive, so you can't see it. So simulation provides that visual understanding of what's happening inside the body that the clinician can have in their mind when they're actually administering the treatment.
That's quite interesting. So clinicians and practitioners, they're not just bringing, the knowledge of the procedure, but they're also taking that knowledge and then helping device companies, or at least in the ideal scenario, they're helping the device companies create these devices in a way that they can accommodate, less invasive surgeries, advocate shorter recovery times. And then that is also further downstream, leading for device companies to improve the way they make the device to accommodate these kinds of features that patients are now pretty much demanding for.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think it's always been, the device industry has always been need based, and that need's always identified by a clinician who recognizes a limitation of what's in the industry today. Sometimes it may be by a patient who realizes the inconvenience and makes suggestions for better ways of doing it. But the device companies are always looking for that feedback mechanism from the real world evidence, because they struggle to recreate the real world in their laboratories. And so it's those people out in the use that really that feedback is essential.
I think the key word you use there is real world evidence and real world data. And I think that's very valuable. Especially today, there's a certain protocol to the way they collect that data. And I would like to touch on that in just a brief minute on how that's shifting. But since you mentioned that it is a needs driven industry, I'd like to take a step back from the patient's needs to the medical device company's needs. So with all the things that we've said so far, it's obvious that patient experience would be a very big influencer, or you know in many ways drive the requirement for medical devices. But in addition to that, are there any other drivers that are kind of inspiring medical device companies to make such changes where they still prioritize the patient, but it's not coming from the patient?
Oh, jump in, Steve.
Well, certainly the cost of developing new devices is always a challenge, and something that we've seen is escalating year in and year out as devices get more complex, harder to replicate the population experience, and of course more personalized devices. So a sustainable way of developing devices as they get complex is essential, because if the cost and time to bring the product to market is too excessive, then these new life-saving treatments will never make it.
I see. So you mentioned the cost of development and the time of development. So in the past, do you feel that patient experience was not as prioritized, and that's probably why the cost of development was not that actively monitored, or it was not that big of an impact on the development process for devices?
Well, I would say, at least in my experience, that the first generations of these products, patient experience was not the number one criteria. It was really the success and efficacy of the device, and the patient, the patient's experience was, were they relieved of their suffering or not. But as we now evolve beyond basic treatment, the patient experience becomes critical to sustainability. And we now have a lot of devices and a lot of treatments. And also, as we alluded to, the clinicians will choose those devices that their patients are happiest with, that they're most comfortable with, because if they understand them, they're going to use them best. And so now they have choices, and those choices create additional hurdles for the industry to overcome.
I think what we're seeing is a natural evolution of the industry, just in the way the automotive industry grew from the very early 1900s to what it is today. It has been marked by a few step changes, but for the most part, it's been a gradual evolution. If we continue with that analogy, there was a lot that the auto industry might have liked to have been able to do in its early days, but the technology wasn't available. or it was too much of a reach to innovate certain capabilities. And I think for the life sciences industry, innovating for an individual patient's experience has always been a little out of reach, for a number of reasons. The technology may not have been there in specific subsegments to be able to adapt a therapy to an individual. Of course, we know that doctors do it every day when they're prescribing pills and medications, and the personalization that takes place there to maximize the experience and the outcome is all about dosage. But when we talk about a specific device or a piece of equipment, it hasn't really been possible to innovate devices for the individual, uh, but also it takes a lot of bandwidth. And as we know, the cost of bringing a new device to market is very, very expensive in both time and money. And so, of course, a company's business model has to accommodate the fact that they can only afford so many products in their portfolio and so much innovation in any one year. They can't overreach themselves and try to be either too innovative or innovate in too many different segments at once, simply because they can't afford it. Now, they need to adapt. And I think what's taking place now is that the tools are being put in their hands that allows them to adapt their business models and take on more innovation that requires more bandwidth, or at least virtual bandwidth, get more out of their current technology development groups than they have in the past. And that added bandwidth is what's going to empower them to be able to innovate for the patient experience. And I think it's perhaps apropos to talk about how what some of those changes are that are empowering them.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to hear more about what those changes would be. I also would like if you could elaborate a little bit more on, you said that doing personalized devices does take a lot of bandwidth, and I agree that it does increase the amount of owners that a medical device company has, and the just amount of tasks that they need to do to create a personalized device. But if you could add a little bit of context on what those things might be, that could really help.
Sure. So quite simply, let's say what could it look like for the diabetic that is managing their own condition at home? So they have to monitor their insulin levels, and then they have to administer a dose of insulin. And for the most part, they're using a finger stick to take a blood sample, and then they are using a injection pen that's maybe a reusable device or a disposable device in which or with which they can dial in a dose, a specific dose of insulin specific to their current blood sugar or the amount of glucose load they expect in the next few hours. So what can improve the patient experience there? Well, most of these devices, they're engineered on a one-fits-all kind of philosophy. A device from one pharmaceutical manufacturer is intended to be applicable to a very broad group of patients, irrespective of their individual tissue conditions. But we can also surmise that the tissue of a 90-year-old female diabetic is very, very different to the tissue of a 20-year-old male diabetic that's a footballer in high school or in college. And so personalization is a very obvious target here, where we might want to ask ourselves, how can we engineer a device that is sufficiently adaptive to those two different tissue conditions? And we want to make it adaptive so that a few targets can be met more readily, targets such as discomfort or ease of handling the device itself and ease of dialing in a dose on the device, accuracy in where the dose is delivered within the skin, at what depth, and dosing time, how quickly it can administer the dose or how long it takes. So with better engineering capabilities and more engineering bandwidth, in this example, more adaptivity can be engineered into the device that can either automatically or perhaps with switches and dials can be tuned to an individual patient.
That's quite interesting. And just thinking about it, I can see two different topics we could go into. One of the ones is the impact of such personalization on, how a company actually develops these devices. But before we get to that, I would like to address, like, regulatory compliance is the bread and butter of this industry. And to even get a device like that on the market, you will need to have the FDA's approval, especially in North America, to be able to, market that device, to personalize that device. Unless they have regulatory approval, they may or may not, they may not be able to, be part of the market or the solution. So from a regulatory standpoint, how do the regulatory bodies like the FDA potentially see something like personalization of devices? Is it something that they're considering as a risk factor? Are there issues with personalization that can potentially derail a company during the regulatory evaluation of it?
Uh, well, let me provide a little bit of at least the discussions that I've had with FDA folks about personalization, because it's a very, very challenging domain, particularly for the regulatory agencies. I guess it very much depends on the scope of the personalization, whether this is an infinitely personalizable, for example, a digital a pump, maybe a diabetes pump or something, where the frequency or the scheme of regulation is tuned directly to the individual patient, and that's done on a learning basis. So that device changes over time. So from a regulatory standpoint, how do you approve a device that's going to change after it goes to the market? So that's a particular challenge. And then, of course, there are devices that might be 3D printed, manufactured on site at a hospital. And then there's also devices, when we think about personalization, there are a range of personalization that's more like best fit or best selection, more like a shoe. Of course, you want to have the best shoe where you get the shoe size and type that fits you best. And you might try on 10 or 12 before you find one that feels right. In the medical device world, you don't have so much freedom to try on 10 or 12 before you get the one that fits correctly for your body. And of course, the implications of a bad fit can be profound. And from a regulatory perspective, if a device which is otherwise successful but is misfit to a patient and shows poor outcome, they struggle to separate the device failure or inability to be effective from the actual treatment, which will improve over time as doctors become better at it. And so all of these schemes focus into demonstrate the fact that relying on traditional clinical trials where they set aside a fixed block of time to evaluate the entirety of that product's effectiveness is not going to work. And they need a better way. And that's where simulation can really help fill in the gaps of where the data is missing. It can do accelerated aging studies, so you can see what's likely to happen 3-5 years from now. And you can understand basic function and also failure mechanisms, so they know what to look for and they can better interpret the data. And they're really eager to embrace those technologies and their understanding of it, because they realize it's the only way to deal with that complexity.
I think you definitely touched a really interesting point there about, simulation being a major part and like how the FDA is being more receptive to it. Um, are they making any accommodations? Are they changing things the way, um, you know, validation and verification is conducted, or are they playing a part in defining some standards that companies can use to justify using simulation?
Yeah, absolutely. The the VNV 40 subcommittee, which we participated on for almost the last 10 years, I can't remember exactly how long, has published guidelines last year, which demonstrate the FDA's recommendations on the best way of using simulation for validating your models and verifying that you're running them correctly. And if you follow those guidelines, they feel far more confident that they'll be able to understand and interpret the data, and they will accelerate the approval process.
Okay, that's very interesting. In your experience, and you may or may not be able to comment on it, but in your experience, have the guidelines played an important part in some devices being accepted into the market and from using simulation?
I would say that along the way, as I said, the development of these guidelines, not to be critical of the folks at the FDA, but it took quite a long time before they felt comfortable. This is a first of a kind document, and so it took quite a while for the document to be published. So along the way, the community, the industry, and the FDA learned a lot. And with that learning, many of the companies that were directly involved, the medical device companies who were learning with the FDA, were implementing those processes so that when the document was published, they had already been using them and been effective. I think, I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere along the line of 30% of all new submissions include simulation data now.
Is that 30% a lot higher, or is that a lot lower than what we would imagine the industry to be right now?
Well, the industry should be 100%. So we have a long way to go. I think, in my opinion, putting a product on the market, or sorry, putting a product into human beings before you've effectively simulated their behavior, so you understand its performance in the real world, I think is higher risk than any company should take. They should know exactly what is going to happen within a high degree of precision. And that's what we've seen in the automotive industry, in the aerospace industry. By the time a car comes to market, they know exactly how it's going to perform. That risk has been reduced to almost zero. And we should be able to do the same for medical devices eventually.
And that's a great vision to have, because there's quite a few complaints and what do you call them? Not reworks.
Recalls?
Recalls, yes. There's quite a few recalls that happen and reworks that happen, and companies, they have to go into a fix-it stage where they need to make changes to the product, and that obviously takes valuable time away from the patients and for the company away from the market. So knowing that the FDA is accepting simulation as part of mathematical and scientific evidence as far as the device's performance goes, what do you think could be some potential, I guess, hurdles or just uncertainties in the minds of the companies, or do you feel that they are actually implementing simulation?
I think that, if I may chime in, I
Yeah.
think there's a number of very fundamental hurdles, not least of which are psychological ones. Companies, the life sciences industry is late to the game in terms of leveraging simulation. Now, do they use simulation? Of course they do. Simulation it's not endemic, nor is it integrated, but it certainly exists in early stages of development. But seldom does it exist all the way through a program into the post-market part of the life cycle of a device. And I think the reason is that, as I said, the industry is late to the game of adopting simulation. I think one of the reasons has been that the regulatory bodies have always heavily emphasized evidence that's based on physical testing, be it bench testing or cadaver testing or animal testing or ultimately the human clinical trials. Part of it has been that our industry has understandably, I think, focused heavily on aerospace and defense and transportation and mobility industries. And we've put a lot of our effort there, and we've allowed the life sciences industry to just adopt simulation at its own pace rather than heavily pushing it. But there's also the third element of um, the perceived dependability of simulation, the perception of how much it can actually be trusted and relied upon. We know from other industries that simulation can be highly predictive, which means it can, in the right circumstances, be used instead of a physical test, and it can be relied upon with at least the same amount of confidence that the physical test can. And I say at least because simulation gives us all kinds of freedom that physical testing does not. So I think there's a number of reasons as to why it's a tool that is not leveraged as extensively as it might. But I think with the regulatory bodies taking a lead in the way they view the role of simulation and the degree to which they will accept evidence that is simulation based is about to have a big impact on the degree to which simulation is being leveraged on programs from ideation all the way through post-market.
Yeah, exactly, Stuart. And let me add, I think, not surprisingly, the simulation in the medical field uh, ultimately requires modeling something to do with the patient. Of course, it varies. Many devices never interact directly with the patient, but most do. And of course, modeling the patient, the human, can be much more challenging, particularly getting good properties for those models. In other industries, the communities have come together in a way that's been a little different than in life sciences, which has been far more, um, uh, I don't know, diverse as opposed to structured. And so there aren't good bodies of standards for material properties, et cetera, for modeling the human. And that's changing now. And it really reflects the a maturing of the industry, similar to what we saw in aerospace and automotive, where the industry shifted from running experiments to test their final products to running experiments to build good models, realizing that the investment of experiments to create good models would pay huge dividends because once the models are created, they can use them over and over again. Whereas the test for a particular device is used once. And so we're beginning to see that change where the industry is beginning to realize they have to run experiments to create good, valid models.
I think that's an excellent addition because from what Stuart said about perceived dependability of the simulation being one of the primary or at least one of the bigger concerns for companies, I think conducting experiments to then build good models and making model building a key priority at least helps address that particular concern. Would you agree?
Yeah, these industries rely to some degree on the accepted standards, accepted margins of safety. We never have zero risk in anything we do. So as a community, we agree to the extent to which we can accept risk, and building models that allow us to all agree on what is safe, I think is a critical step forward.
And that's a great note to take a pause for today. Thank you very much, Steve and Stuart, for your comments and insight into the advent and extent to which simulation can play a part in medical devices and life sciences. To summarize what we've heard today is that personalization of medical devices, while once an unreachable goal, is now within your grasp. We have heard that some of the key hurdles in adopting simulation, such as regulatory support, the availability of robust models, and the successes from parallel industries, are becoming increasingly more friendly to the user to the company, and ultimately to the patient population. The critical and key step forward is to look at simulation as a way to validate the performance of medical devices and also to use simulation to build models for predictive behavior so that eventually you can reduce the cost and time of development. With that said, if you wish to use simulation in your business, please contact us through our website at www.aventec.com/contact us, or you can call us at 1-905-305-1711, and we can help you with your questions and move forward. In the next part, we will take a deeper look at how core technologies from Dassault Systems and the philosophy behind them is already helping medical device companies ideate the right product and make their products right the first time. This novel approach from Dassault Systems is drawing on the successes from other successful industries such as aerospace and defense and the transportation industry. The next part will be made available on demand next week. Until then, think forward. This is Shashank from Aventec. It's been a pleasure.